Millions of Americans are currently traveling home on routes that have seen horrible horrors as you view this video. Some roads retain the memory of every scream, final gasp, and terrifying moment. I'm going to take you on a tour of America's most haunted highway tonight, where the living wish they would never turn off their motors and the dead never sleep. You believe you understand fear? Do you believe you've heard all the ghost stories? Rethink your thought. These are not urban legends or campfire stories that have been passed down through the ages. These are recorded experiences of actual people on actual highways that you may travel on tomorrow evening. From the shrieking bridge where college students disappear without a trace to the headless flagman who saves lives while seeking retribution for his own violent death, to the ghost trucker of Route 491 who shows up in your mirrors right before you die. You'll be drawn farther into a nightmare that runs from coast to coast and is linked by something far more terrible than chance in each story. However, here's what sets this horror channel apart from all the others you've subscribed to. I tell you more than simply ghost stories. I immerse you in the police records, the witnesses' thoughts, and the story of dread that these freeways have weaved into American culture. When you see headlights in your rearview mirror at 3 in the morning, you'll know why some highways should never be driven alone, why some exits should never be taken, and why. You will never forget this moment. Then click the subscribe button to get confirmed fears now. Because there is no going back once you go on this road with me. I promise you won't want to miss what's about to happen. So ring that notification bell. Are you prepared to confront the reality of what lies ahead on the roads in America? Together, let's find out. Now let's go to our first tale. And I want you to grasp something from the beginning. This isn't your typical ghost story about a trucker that you hear at truck stops. This concerns Marcus Big Mike Rodriguez, a lengthy haul veteran of 23 years. A man who never believed in anything he couldn't see, touch, or fix with a wrench, and who has driven every imaginable stretch of asphalt from Seattle to Miami. Other truck drivers admired Marcus as a driver. He is dependable, professional, and fundamentally pragmatic. The ghost stories on CB radio about haunting semis and phantom hitchhikers that reportedly haunted America's highways would make him laugh. Before everything he believed he knew about Route 491 in Colorado changed permanently one October night, that doubt kept him sane for decades of nocturnal runs. Most drivers would rather not talk about the history of Route 491. Originally known as Highway 666, it was dubbed the Devil's Highway due to the high number of deadly accidents that happened along its 200-mile span across Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, in addition to its menacing designation. The following years of sign theft and growing pressure from religious organizations, the roadway was renumbered in 2003. However, the blood that has been spilled on that asphalt cannot be erased by changing the numbers. Having driven 491 hundreds of times, Marcus was familiar with the numbers. However, numbers didn't keep him up at night, but the events of October 15, 2019 would follow him around for the rest of his life. The time was 2:47 a.m. Marcus was transporting a cargo of construction equipment from Denver to Albuquerque when he pulled his Peterbilt 379 onto Route 491 southbound. It was a clear night with a temperature of about 38 degrees, and the cool mountain air that generally made driving enjoyable. There was the normal late-night conversation on his CB radio, the pleasant companionship of the road, drivers exchanging weather reports and alerting one another to speed traps. His regular dispatch operator, Sarah Chen, had arrived at 2:30 a.m., verifying his path and anticipated time of arrival. It was all the same. Before Marcus noticed the headlights in his passenger side mirror, everything was as usual. First, another semi running the same route didn't seem out of the ordinary. About 4 miles behind, the headlights came into view, staying at a constant distance and not catching up or falling behind. Marcus didn't give it any thought. Particularly on long, desolate sections like 491, professional drivers frequently found themselves in unofficial convoys. However, as the miles went by, something started to seem off. The truck behind him never changed lanes, never adjusted its distance, and didn't even appear to swing in time with the road's natural rhythm. Those headlights seemed to be locked onto his trailer and followed with a mechanical accuracy that was impossible for a human driver to match. By the 47th mile, Marcus's discomfort had turned into real worry. He cycled through channels 19, 17, and 9 in an attempt to raise the trailing driver on the CB, but he got no answer. The headlights were steady, unblinking, almost mesmerizing in their consistency. Marcus chose to put his disciple to the test. He slowed down from 65 to 55 mph and then to 50 mph. The headlights stayed precisely at that distance. Pushing his rig harder than usual on the twisty mountain roadway, he accelerated back to 70 mph. The distance, however, remained constant. The truck behind him seemed to be connected to his car in some way, following every move he made with uncanny accuracy. At mile marker 52, there was the first concrete indication that something was seriously amiss. Marcus realized that the headlights in his mirror were not the typical round or rectangular beams found on contemporary trucks. Commercial cars have not utilized sealed beam headlights since the 1970s, therefore they were outdated. The light itself seemed to pierce the darkness in an odd way, with a yellowish, even sickening quality. Marcus wiped his eyes, believing that he was deceiving himself with his weariness. But the lights were still there, still following, still incorrect. When he glanced again, 3:15 a.m. Marcus took a choice that most likely saved his life. He tugged in an attempt to face his enigmatic companion at the Cortez truck stop at mile marker 61. He kept a close eye on his mirrors as he maneuvered his Peterbilt into the parking lot, wondering what kind of truck had been following him for the previous 30 miles. But the headlights just disappeared as he turned into the truck stop. They disappeared as if they had never been there, not dimmed, not switched off. For 20 minutes, Marcus remained in his cab with the engine running, looking around the highway and the truck stop, but he saw no other cars. Uneasy, but at 3:45 a.m., Marcus pulled back onto Route 491, determined to finish his journey. The roadway was deserted for the next 15 miles, just as he liked it. Even though it was not unusual for the late hour, the silence on his CB radio felt oppressive, as though the air surrounding his truck had thickened. The headlights then came back at mile marker 76. Marcus could swear he heard the deep rumbling of a diesel engine that seemed to come from everywhere as they appeared considerably closer this time, about 100 yards behind his trailer, and not at all once. Marcus knew that every law of physics was broken by what transpired next. As the phantom truck started to pass him, it appeared to be traveling via the median rather than into the left lane, its headlights visible through the rocky terrain and scrub brush that should have prevented it from doing so. As the spectral lorry drew beside his taxi, Marcus gazed in dread, and he saw the truck itself for the first time. It was a faded blue Kenworth from the 1970s that appeared to absorb light instead of reflect it. The driver's side door was dotted with what seemed to be bullet holes, and the cab itself was damaged and dented. However, Marcus's blood froze in his veins because of the driving. The person driving was hardly human. A skeletal body with empty eye sockets that somehow managed to project evil intelligence, encased in the frayed remnants of a flannel shirt. The ghostly chauffeur pivoted to face Marcus. Suddenly, Marcus heard a voice that seemed as though it were coming from inside his own skull. "Hey boy, you're on my road now. It's time for the toll." Marcus's trailer started to get crowded by the spectral truck, pushing him in the direction of the guardrail and the 200-foot drop beyond. Marcus struggled with the wheel. His years of as the phantom semi attempted to force him over the brink. Experience was the only thing keeping his truck on the asphalt. The battle probably lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. While the phantom truck kept up its unrelenting pressure, Marcus shifted down and used his engine brake to decelerate his load. The phantom truck abruptly accelerated and vanished into the darkness ahead, leaving only the pungent scent of burning rubber and something more behind, just as it appeared that the guardrail would give way and send Marcus crashing into the canyon below. Marcus thought it looked like a morgue. At mile marker 82, Marcus was able to halt his truck. He was having trouble using his CB radio since his hands were shaking so much. His voice was hardly more than a whisper when he raised Sarah Chen at dispatch. "I need you to record this call, Sarah. It is 4:23 a.m. October 15th. I recently had a meeting with, I'm not sure what to name it. Although that wasn't typical, another truck attempted to run me off the road. Sarah's professional and worried voice crackled back. Are you hurt, Marcus? Do you require emergency assistance? Marcus recognized how crazy his narrative would seem as he glanced in his mirrors at the deserted roadway that stretched in both directions. No, I'm fine, Sarah. I just wanted to record that I had to halt in an emergency because aggressive driving style. However, Marcus was aware that something was wrong. He was about to set out again when he saw something that chilled him to the bone. There were tire marks, not from his own truck, but from another semi, burned into the asphalt next to his truck. Marcus recognized the pattern formed by the deep scars, which appeared to have been made by a vehicle hauling an impossible-to-be-heavy weight. A date was written in the skid marks, October 15, 1974. Marcus finished his run to Albuquerque precisely 45 years ago today, but he never again took Route 491. After investigating the date burned into the asphalt, he learned that a truck driver named Dale Morrison had been discovered dead in his overturned Kenworth at mile marker 82 on October 15, 1974. The investigating officer's notes indicated something odd, but the official cause of death was a single vehicle accident. The driver's side door of Morrison's truck had been shot through, and there were indications that he had struggled. Dale's lawsuit was never resolved. Morrison was laid to rest in Cortez, Colorado, in an unmarked burial. 6 months later, Marcus resigned from long-haul trucking, but he continues to keep an eye on the CB radio channels that broadcast on Route 491. He hears the same story every few months. Around mile marker 82, a trucker has been reporting aggressive conduct from another semi, always at night. Every description is the same: a skeletal driver, an old Kenworth with yellowish headlights, and the overpowering stench of death. Marcus has attempted to alert other motorists. However, most people write his account off as either too much coffee or road weary. Those who believe him just go in a different direction, because some drivers never stop collecting their toll, and certain roads, Marcus discovered, never forget their dead. Let's go on to the second tale, and this one will make you doubt all you think you know about protecting spirits and the price of curiosity. This leads us to Pennsylvania's backcountry, where Suskin Road wounds like a gash through forlorn valleys and thick woodlands. No tourist map would show this as a freeway. Locals steer clear of the tiny, deteriorating asphalt strip after dark, and with good cause. When Catherine Mills, a young woman, drove her automobile off the bridge at Dead Man's Curve in 1952 and into the rocky creek bed below, the route gained notoriety. Every generation since claims that her cries, which reverberated throughout the valley that night, have never ceased. Some tales are considerably more frightening than anyone realized, though, as demonstrated by what occurred to 3 college students on Halloween night in 2021. Sophia Blackwood, a folklore and mythology major and junior at Penn State, had an inquisitive nature that frequently gets her into trouble. She came onto references to the Susan Screamer, a spectral woman dressed in white who appeared on the destroyed bridge and warned cars of approaching catastrophe with spine-tingling screams, while investigating local stories for her thesis on spooky folklore in rural Pennsylvania. Sophia found the narrative fascinating since, in contrast to other ghost stories, this one had laws. You had to get to the bridge site at precisely midnight, wait, and honk your horn 3 times. Catherine Mills would show up and yell if she thought you were worth her warning. You were safe if she did not show up. If she showed there but said nothing, it meant that you were going to die soon, and that it was inevitable. The uniformity of the tales was what made Sophia's investigation so convincing. Each witness recounted the identical procedure, the identical timing, and the identical chilling sensation. Scream that would make adult men cry and break vehicle windows. The apparition persisted in appearing at the original site, standing on intangible stone arches that no longer existed, despite the bridge itself having been dismantled in 1987, following 3 consecutive deadly accidents in a single month. Since 1952, local historian Margaret Kowalski had recorded more than 40 encounters. Additionally, the witness passed away within 72 hours in each instance where Catherine Mills showed up but said nothing. heart attacks, car crashes, strange industrial mishaps. All of these may be attributed to chance. When Sophia learned that her own great-grandmother, Helen Blackwood, had been a victim of Catherine Mills, her scholarly interest turned into a personal fixation. Her car's brakes failed on a steep slope 2 days after Helen's encounter with the silent screamer in 1963. According to family archives, the brake lines had been damaged according to the official accident report, but the inquiry found that the corrosion was caused by road salt. Sophia was wiser. She realized that there was more to Catherine Mills than a warning system. She served as a jury, judge, and executioner, choosing who survived and who perished according to standards that no one alive could comprehend. Sophia persuaded her boyfriend Jake Morrison and their friend Destiny Kim to go with her to Suskin Road on Halloween night in 2021 so she could conduct what she referred to as field research. Destiny studied engineering and viewed the paranormal with scientific skepticism, whereas Jake, a psychology major, thought the ghost stories were expressions of societal trauma. More to make Sophia laugh than out of any real desire, both agreed to the adventure. Have faith in the legend. Following Sophia's hand-drawn map, they navigated the twisting mountain roads in Jake's Honda Civic to the precise location where the bridge had once been. As though time had paused the instant the bridge was destroyed, the site was uncannily maintained. Only 30 feet of empty air and decades' worth of stored fear separated the ancient stone abutments that still protruded from each side of Willow Creek. Around the site, old oak trees created a natural cathedral. In the moonlight, their bare branches cast twisted shadows. The only sounds were the distant hoot of an owl and the soft babble of the brook below. However, there was another element, a sense of tension that caused the three students to speak in low tones without understanding why. 11:58 p.m. Sophia parked Jake's vehicle toward the opening where the span used to cross, just where the bridge approach had been. She had done a great deal of research on the ceremony, consulting several sources to make sure they adhered to the rules. Exactly. 3 rapid-fire honkings of the horn were required. After then, they had to wait for precisely 3 minutes, in total quiet. They were supposed to stay in the car no matter what if Catherine Mills showed up. They were safe if she yelled. They had 72 hours to survive if she didn't speak. Reaching over Jake, Sophia pressed the horn 3 times as the dashboard clock struck midnight. As though the signal were being amplified by the air itself, the sound reverberated over the valley with an unusual resonance. The waiting followed. Destiny held her phone ready to film whatever occurred next, as Jake gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. Sophia fixed her gaze on the vacant area where the bridge had been. She was certain that the others could hear her heart thumping so loudly. 12:01 a.m. The car's interior temperature suddenly plummeted by 20 degrees. Despite the mild October weather, their breath was visible as ice started to build on the windows. The sound of the brook below ceased, as though the water were holding its breath. Then a figure started to appear in the gap between the stone abutments. She emerged gradually, solidifying with every second, like a snapshot taking shape in a pitch-black room. As the witnesses had described, Catherine Mills was a young woman in her early 20s, dressed in a white clothing that seemed to radiate light from within. Her eyes were filled with the despair that comes from decades of unwitting submission to unfathomable powers, and her dark hair hung in damp threads around her face. As though the steel and stone were still there, she stood on the unseen bridge. The road would have been exactly where her bare feet were. She only looked at the 3 pupils for a bit, her face unreadable. The scream that came out of Catherine Mills's mouth was unlike anything any of them had ever heard. It was more than just noisy. It sounded as if it were hitting the ears instead, right into the soul. The car windows weren't just broken. The pupils were sprayed with safety glass as they exploded inward. The layers of agony, anger, and warning in the scream appealed to a primordial aspect of the human psyche. It was the sound of every lover who had been deceived, every mother who had lost a child, and every innocent person who had passed away too soon. But something went awry as the scream intensified. Catherine Mills's face shifted from one of somber caution to one of bewildered fear. Her mouth parted again as she glanced down at her feet and then back at the students. There was no sound this time. Desperately trying to convey the warning that would save their lives, she was straining to shout. However, a force stronger than her own spectral will had hushed her. Jake was eager to find out what would happen next. He pressed the pedal and flung the car into reverse, sending gravel flying. Flying as they retreated from the location of the bridge. They could see Catherine Mills standing on her phantom bridge in the rearview mirror, her arms stretching out to them in a desperate supplication, her lips open in a silent scream. She was attempting to warn them, but she was frustrated by something. There was frightened stillness on the trip back to campus, until they arrived at Jake's dorm room, where they sat in horrified contemplation of what the silent scream might signify. None of them discussed what they had seen. Sophia had done her homework clearly. Death was certain within 72 hours if Catherine Mills showed up but said nothing. What they had seen, however, was different. It seems that whatever force possessed her had chosen their fate apart from her normal judgment because she had attempted to scream, but had been stopped. Under the threat of oncoming disaster, the students attempted to keep to their regular schedules over the course of the following 3 days. Jake developed an obsession with safety, constantly inspecting all of his car's mechanical systems and staying away from anything that could be construed as even slightly hazardous, including elevators and stairs. Destiny jumped right into her studies. In an attempt to rationalize the impossibility, they sought a scientific explanation for their experiences. Sophia studied the legend in further detail, looking for any cases in which Catherine Mills had been silenced and what it may indicate. The third night, precisely at 12:03 a.m. 72 hours following their meeting, Destiny Kim just disappeared. She was video chatting with her folks in California while she was in her dorm room. Her roommate discovered the room empty. When the call stopped abruptly, with no indication of how she had fled or evidence of struggle, from the inside, the window remained locked. Security cameras showed that no one was entering or leaving the facility, and the entrance had been closed. It was as though Destiny Kim had just vanished from the face of the earth. The police inquiry evolved into nothing. Although Destiny was never located, her disappearance was reported as a missing person case. Although Jake and Sophia were aware of the reality, they were also aware that no one would take them seriously. They had paid the price for their curiosity after witnessing something that existed outside the accepted laws of life and death. Another victim had been taken by the Suscon Screamer legend, but this time the technique was different, more vicious, and intimate. Sophia never finished her miraculous folklore thesis. After graduating, she relocated to Arizona, which is as far away from Pennsylvania as possible, and changed her major to accounting. Jake needed years of therapy to recover from his acute anxiety and depression. However, on calm evenings with the perfect wind, they both claimed to be able to hear Catherine Mills straining to scream, still trying to provide the warning that may have prevented their friend's death. The Suscon Road Bridge site is still unoccupied. Over a creek that turns red on some evenings, the stone abutments stand like sentinels. Barriers have been erected by the local government to keep vehicles away from the site. However, they are unable to block the past, and whenever someone is stupid enough to honk their horn 3 times at midnight, the screams that reverberate across the valley cannot be silenced, because some protectors are more hazardous than the perils they are meant to safeguard against, and some warnings arrive too late. Let's go on to our third story, which will demonstrate that some land claims go much beyond the grave itself and are more profound than any title or deed. We are traveling to the Sierra Nevada in California. Prospectors Road goes through the Nevada highlands, which were formerly the center of gold rush territory. The idealized depiction of the 1849 gold rush in movies is not this. This is about the harsh truth of those who died defending claims that weren't worth the blood that was shed over them and who killed for a handful of dust. However, a miner's labor does not usually cease with death. Additionally, some prospectors never stopped excavating or protecting what they thought was theirs. After 15 years of patrolling the isolated areas of the Sierra National Forest Park, Ranger Vincent Caldwell believed he had seen everything the mountains had to offer. Having served in the military, Vincent was a pragmatic individual who approached his work with meticulous accuracy and an understanding of the historical significance of the area that he is protecting. His portion of Prospectors Road was a narrow, winding dirt road that connected a number of abandoned 1850s mining sites, where men had lived and died in search of gold that had long since been extracted from the earth, and where fortunes had been made and lost. Dr. Rebecca Santos was a UC Berkeley historian who focused on labor issues and mining claim conflicts during the gold rush. She had asked for authorization to carry out studies in the isolated areas of the forest, with a particular focus on between 1851 and 1853, a slew of violent incidents had taken place along Prospectors Road. Her investigation had turned up evidence of at least 12 killings connected to territorial conflicts and claim jumping, the majority of which had never been formally looked into by the limited law enforcement of the time. The case of Jeremiah Thorne, a prospector who had been discovered shot dead in 1852, piqued Rebecca's interest. 3 days after his death, his body was found with a pickaxe still in his hand and arranged as though he had been standing up for his rights even in death. On 23 September, about 8 miles from the closest paved road, on Prospectors Road in 2022, Vincent was on his weekly patrol when he came across Dr. Santos at the Thorne claim site. On a folding table, she had arranged a modest study station with metal detectors, surveying tools, and old records. A few decaying wooden stakes and a rusting plaque that said, "Thorne's Luck Established. 1851," indicated the site. However, there had always been something about the location that made Vincent uneasy. As though the soil itself had been tainted by ancient conflict, the greenery grew differently here, scant and stunted. As they explored the limits of the first claim, Dr. Santos gave Vincent an explanation of her findings. Jeremiah Thorne had found a very rich vein of gold in the creek that flowed through this region of the mountain, according to her records. He had worked and legally filed his claim, it by itself for almost a year, amassing what modern reports said was a sizable fortune in gold nuggets and dust. Thorne, on the other hand, had a habit of sleeping on the site with a loaded rifle and a reputation for firing first and then asking questions because he was paranoid and believed that other miners were planning to jump his claim. In 1852, the murder had taken place on a misty October morning. According to 3 guys, before morning, jumpers from a camp downstream had come to Thorne's site with the intention of killing him and seizing control of his enterprise. Thorne, however, had been anticipating their arrival. The ensuing gunfire left all 4 men dead, with Thorne killing his 3 assailants before he was killed by his own wounds. Days later, a passing prospector discovered his body, still holding his pickaxe, placed over the opening to his mine shaft, as though he were still protecting it in death. For Dr. Santos, the case was especially intriguing because of what transpired. Next, Thorne's claim has failed every time it was attempted. Despite being young and in good health, the 3 men who attempted to take over the site in 1853 were discovered dead from what appeared to be heart attacks. 5 employees of a mining firm that bought the claim in 1854 were killed in a string of mishaps, cave-ins, equipment malfunctions, and mysterious falls before the effort was abandoned. The location had become so ominous that no one would labor it by 1860, and it had stayed undeveloped ever since. Vincent and Dr. Santos started to notice something odd as they talked about the site's historical significance. There was no sound at all in the surrounding woodland. There were no insects buzzing, no bird song, and no tiny animals moving in the undergrowth. Despite the afternoon sun, the temperature had significantly decreased, and Vincent could not detect the odor in the air, something like new earth combined with old blood, both organic and metallic. When she stopped, Dr. Santos began photographing the claim markings. Her camera abruptly stopped in the middle of her face. Her voice was barely heard as she muttered, "Did you hear that?" Vincent's ears were straining. Then he also heard it. From someplace beneath their feet came a tapping sound that was rhythmic, like metal hitting stone. The pattern of the sound, which was subtle but constant, implied careful, meticulous labor. No one else was around, and the closest active mining activity was at than 50 meters distant, but it was the distinct sound of a pickaxe biting into rock. The tapping went on for a few minutes, getting louder and more demanding over time. Thinking the noise may be interference, Vincent checked his radio, but it was silent. When Dr. Santos realized that her historical research was becoming a real and present danger, her academic decorum broke and she became pale. It sounded as though someone was working their way down the original gold vein, following the old creek bed that passed through Thorne's claim. The voice then appeared, a loud murmur that seemed as though it were coming from the ground itself. "Leave my claim alone." Said with the power that comes from complete conviction, the statements were unambiguous and plain. Immediately, Vincent's hand went to his service weapon. What could he arrest, though? What was he able to shoot? This time the voice was stronger and had a violent edge that caused both researchers to back off. "This is my mountain, my claim, and my gold." In an effort to preserve her scientific objectivity, Dr. Santos took out a digital recorder and made an effort to capture their experiences. However, as she lifted the gadget, the tapping sound abruptly stopped and was replaced by an oppressively quiet silence. The sky was still clear, but the air became heavy and thick like a storm coming. Then there was the sound of footsteps coming from the direction of the old mine shaft. On uneven terrain, wearing heavy boots, walking with the methodical speed of someone who was well aware of their destination, Vincent took Dr. Santos by the arm and started to back away toward their cars, but the footsteps followed them, staying at a steady 20 feet or so. They heard the scrape of metal on stone, the crunch of gravel, and something more, but they couldn't see anyone. Breathing heavily, as though the person pursuing them was carrying a big load. Old blood stench intensified, now combined with the sharp smell of gunpowder and something that reminded Vincent from his time in the service. The distinct smell of bloody death. When they arrived at Vincent's ranger car, Dr. Santos made a critical error. She screamed at what she saw when she turned to face the claim site. A tall, haggard guy dressed in the rough attire of a prospector from the 1850s stood among the rotting claim posts. They were able to see that this was not a real person, even though a wide-brimmed hat partially covered his face. There were dark stains on his chest that could only be dried blood, and his skin had the gray flow of an old corpse. He held a pickaxe in his hands, which glowed with a strange light, as though it had been crafted from something other than regular steel. The ghostly prospector lifted his pickaxe and aimed it straight at Dr. Santos, whose words reverberated with unearthly clarity over the distance. "Are you curious about my claim? Do you wish to uncover my secrets? Then remain and work. Stay put and dig. Like everyone else, stay and die." The figure started to approach them with the resolute gait of a man who had worked hard to finish, and wouldn't be put off by something as insignificant as death, rather than the shambling gait of a zombie from a movie. There was no waiting to see what would happen next for Vincent. He pushed. As they sped down Prospector's Road in the direction of the main highway, Dr. Santos climbed into the passenger seat of his car and startled the engine, sending pebbles flying. He could see the ghostly prospector in his rearview mirror, standing in the center of the road and continuing to point his pickaxe at them. The farther he got, the more terrifying he seemed to be. For the first 10 miles, they drove in silence as they tried to comprehend what had happened to them. The first to speak was Dr. Santos, who spoke in a trembling but resolute voice. "We must return. This is a life-changing discovery. Evidence of postmortem consciousness and territorial behavior that goes beyond biological death has been documented." However, Vincent's head was already trembling. Everything about Jeremiah Thorne's ghost shouted danger, and he'd seen enough fighting to know when he was in peril. After arriving at the ranger station, Vincent submitted a report suggesting that researchers and hikers be prohibited from accessing the Thorne-claimed site. He mentioned possible environmental risks and unstable ground conditions, but he was aware of the true cause. Some areas were supposed to stay unaltered. Miners who refused to acknowledge the end of their time were still working some claims. After returning to Berkeley, Dr. Santos attempted to plan a follow-up expedition, but was unable to find volunteers. The scholarly community had heard about her encounter on the Prospector's Road. Even while several of her co-workers were intrigued by her research, none of them were prepared to take the chance of meeting Jeremiah Thorne's spirit in person. Her studies remained unfinished, and her data was rejected by her colleagues as stress-induced hallucinations. Vincent, however, kept patrolling the area. And in the months that followed, he recorded a series of odd occurrences. Hikers claimed to have heard whispered advice to avoid the area and pickaxe sounds. Around the old claim, metal detectorists discovered that certain parts of their apparatus were broken. Worst of all, 3 different people were discovered unconscious after attempting to visit the Thorn site despite the stated warnings. They had no recollection of what had occurred to them, but their hands had odd wounds and calluses that were indicative of extended usage of mining equipment. Jeremiah Thorn was no longer merely defending his claim, Vincent understood. In an attempt to make the living finish the work that death had interrupted, he was hiring laborers. By employing unwilling workers who were forced to dig until they passed out from weariness or worse, the phantom prospector had managed to carry on with his mining operation. Despite being marked with warnings about unstable ground and environmental concerns, the Thorn claim site is still legally closed to the public. Vincent, however, is aware of the reality. He can still hear the sound of a pickaxe hitting stone and smell the mixture of gunpowder and blood that marks Jeremiah Thorn's eternal claim on calm evenings when he patrols the isolated parts of Prospector's Road. Due to the fact that some guys never quit protecting what they think is theirs and never quit working. And in a mine that never shuts, death is merely another shift. Let's go on to the 4th tale. Additionally, this one will make you reevaluate your beliefs regarding time, mortality, and the fine line that separates assisting someone from being their victim. We're heading to the barren section of Route 2A that winds through the Hannesville woods in Maine, where the trees are so dense that they block out the sun even at noon, and where if your car breaks down in the winter, the cold may kill you in a matter of minutes. Good Samaritans go to die on this road, where good deeds turn into invitations to something more darker than a straightforward ghost story. For 12 years, Daniel Reeves, an insurance adjuster, had been traveling Route 2A to evaluate claims in the isolated settlements dotted around Washington County on a monthly basis. Daniel was a man who prided himself on his dependability, prompt, meticulous, and sincerely caring about those whose lives had been upended by fires, accidents, and natural calamities, because he recognized that behind every file number was a person in crisis. He frequently went above and beyond the call of duty to assist innumerable families in navigating the bureaucratic labyrinth of insurance claims. As Daniel drove home on February 14, 2023, from a especially challenging case, just before Valentine's Day, a young family was homeless due to a house fire. A winter storm was approaching from the north, and the already dangerous mountain route was covered in a layer of black ice as the temperature plunged to -5 degrees. Even though Daniel's Ford Explorer had 4-wheel drive and snow tires, he was aware that even seasoned drivers might be risky on Route 2A in the winter. Locals referred to the route as Death's Highway and avoided it at all costs because it had taken scores of lives over the years. 11:47 p.m. A man standing by the side of the road close to mile marker 23 was highlighted by Daniel's headlights as the first heavy snowflakes started to fall. The woman, who looked to be in her mid-20s, was dressed in a flimsy white dress that appeared totally out of place in the terrible weather. She wasn't attempting to flag him down or wave. She was just standing there, motionless, like though she was waiting for something. Daniel's initial reaction was worry. The closest town was more than 20 meters away, and no one could last more than a few minutes in that kind of weather wearing so little. The chilly air pricked Daniel's face as he pulled over and rolled down his window. The woman turned to face Daniel, and he was struck by her beauty. Dark hair that draped in perfect waves in spite of the wind, eyes that carried a sadness so deep it made his chest hurt, and pale skin that seemed to glow in his headlights. "Miss, are you okay? Do you need help?" he asked. Daniel didn't hesitate, unlocked the passenger door, and motioned for her to get in. "Of course. Climb in before you freeze to death." Her voice was soft and melodic, with a faint accent that Daniel couldn't place. "I need a ride. My car broke down about 5 miles back, and I've been walking for hours. Death. By the way, my name is Daniel." The woman slid gracefully into the passenger seat, and Daniel saw that she wasn't shivering, and her dress wasn't even wet from the snow. "Thank you so much," she said, settling into the seat. "My name is Claire. Morrison Claire." Daniel attempted to calm his passenger by striking up a conversation as he re-entered Route 2A. "Where were you going tonight? You don't want to get stuck on this road in the dead of winter." Claire's demeanor was sad and aloof as she gazed out the window. "I was heading home. I haven't been around for so long, and all I wanted to do was get home." Daniel took a closer look at her because of something in her voice. Her skin was nearly translucent in the green glow of the dashboard lights, and he thought he could see the seat fabric through her body. Daniel shook his head, blaming the optical illusion on exhaustion and the pressure of safe driving. "Where do you call home? I am fairly familiar with this area. Even though it's off the main route, I might be able to bring you close." Claire's eyes appeared to reflect light like an animal's when she turned to face him. "Hannahsville. My spouse and I had previously resided there." She trailed off, and although he couldn't see them well, Daniel saw that her hands were folded in her lap. They appeared to be there, but they weren't. Present, but in some way negligible. As they drove more into the woods, the talk went on. But Daniel started to see contradictions in Claire's account. She stated information about Hannahsville that was different from what he knew about the town, such as roads that had been rerouted, companies that had closed decades before, and people who had passed away years earlier. When she suggested a restaurant, and he politely corrected her, Claire was perplexed, as though she was unable to comprehend why her knowledge was inaccurate. But she insisted, "But I was just there last week, located directly on Main Street. Is the Blue Moon Diner. The county's best apple pie is still made by Martha." Daniel was aware that the Blue Moon Diner was never rebuilt when it burned down in 1987. The owner, Martha Henley, had perished in the fire. However, he was hesitant to press because of Claire's assurance and the sincere bewilderment in her tone. The problem. Rather, he concentrated on driving, battling the progressively hazardous road conditions as the storm grew stronger. The wind was howling through the trees like tormented spirits, and the snow was falling so hard now that his wipers could hardly keep the windshield clear. 12:23 a.m. Claire grew upset all of a sudden. She yelled, "Stop the car!" with urgency. Daniel looked around, but he couldn't find anything that would necessitate an emergency stop. "You need to stop the car right now." "What's the matter? I see nothing at all." Claire's voice became almost frantic. "Daniel, you must stop, please. An accident is going to happen, an awful mishap. I see it taking place." Her anguish was so real that Daniel slowed down. However, as he did, Claire grabbed the steering wheel and gave it a forceful pull to the right. The engine stalled amid the sudden hush as the expedition went off the road and came to stop against a snowbank. Daniel heard it just as he was ready to insist for an explanation, the noise of twisted metal and screeching brakes coming from someplace up the road. He could make out the horrible crunch of a car hitting trees, followed by the dizzying brilliance of headlights spinning furiously through the swirling snow. Somehow, Claire had known that an accident would occur right where they would have been if she hadn't made him stop. Daniel said, his voice almost audible above a whisper. "How did you know?" He could see the tears running down Claire's cheeks in the low light as she turned to face him. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "Claire, what are you talking about? Who are you, really?" Claire's form started to shimmer, becoming more translucent with each passing moment. "Because I've seen it before. I've seen it happen so many times, and I can never stop it. I can only save the ones who pick me up, the ones who show kindness to a stranger. Second, I died on this road, Daniel." February 14th, 1987. My husband and I were heading home from dinner when we hit black ice at mile marker 28. Our car rolled down the embankment and went off the road, and he died instantly, but I survived for 3 hours, trapped in the wreckage, calling for help that never arrived, freezing to death alone in the dark and finding it impossible to let go when I finally passed away. Every night I walk this road looking for drivers who might suffer the same fate. When someone stops to help me, someone who shows the kindness that no one showed me, I try to save them from the accidents I can see coming. Daniel's hands were shaking as he reached for his phone to call for help for the accident ahead. But Claire went on with her story. But there's a price, Daniel. There's always a price for cheating death. When Daniel looked at the screen more closely, he saw something that made his blood freeze. The date displayed was February 14th, 1987. Not 2023, but 1987. 36 years ago. Claire, he said slowly. What's the price? What happens to the people you save? Daniel asked. The phone in his hand showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in this remote area. Time, Daniel. Time is the prize. You can't cheat death without giving up something in return. I saved you from that accident, but now you're here with me in my time, in my moment of death. You're trapped in February 14th, 1987, just like I am. You'll live this night. Claude's form was growing more ethereal by the moment, and her voice was fading like an echo. Repeatedly, saving other drivers until someone else takes your place. Daniel noticed that his face was already starting to change in the rearview mirror, turning paler and more translucent. He could feel his body temperature lowering to match the winter night, and his heated breath was no longer hazy in the chilly air. His question was, how long? How much time do I have to complete this? Claire's voice had become a whisper on the wind, hardly heard anymore. It's always worked that way, Daniel. Until someone else is as nice as you were, until another. Good Samaritan comes to the aid of a stranger on a cold night, then you may relax and they'll take your place. He was stuck on Route 2A in 1987 with no way to call for help, no way to get home, and no way out of the never-ending loop of February 14th. As the hours went by, Daniel started to comprehend his new life. He would walk the road, appearing to our drivers as a stranded motorist in need. Daniel tried to start the Explorer, but the engine wouldn't turn over, and the fuel gauge showed empty even though he'd filled the tank that morning. The first driver Daniel saved was a young woman named Sarah, who stopped to help him on what she believed to be February 15th, 2023, but which was actually February 14th, 1987. He saw her face change from concern to confusion to horror as she realized that those who stopped and showed kindness to a stranger would be saved from accidents he could somehow foresee, but they would also be trapped, forced to take his place in the never-ending cycle of death and salvation that had claimed Claire Morrison 36 years ago. Then Sarah replaced him, walking the road in search of the next Good Samaritan, while Daniel faded into the passenger seat of her car, becoming the hitchhiker who would lead the next victim to safety and damnation. Route 2, which passes through the woods of Haynesville, is still one of the most dangerous roads in Maine, with an abnormally high number of accidents that are somehow avoided at the last minute by drivers who report picking up hitchhikers who warn them of impending danger. The Maine State Police have looked into dozens of these reports, but they have never found any evidence of the mysterious passengers who allegedly saved the lives of these drivers. Daniel Reeves was reported missing on February 15, 2023, after failing to return home from a business trip. His Ford Explorer was discovered abandoned on Route 2A, but Daniel himself was nowhere to be seen. The official investigation determined that he had likely wandered into the woods and died of exposure, but his body was never recovered. His family continues to hope that he will return someday, unaware that he is still out there, helping people, still caught in a never-ending cycle of kindness and consequence. On the Devil's Promenade is a rural highway that has been haunted by an unexplained light phenomenon for more than a century. It is not swamp gas or headlights reflecting off atmospheric moisture. Rather, it is something that defies every law of physics. Let's move on to our fifth story, which will demonstrate that some mysteries are better left unsolved, that some phenomena exist beyond the realm of human understanding, and that scientific inquiry should never challenge them. As a quantum physicist from MIT who specialized in electromagnetic anomalies and unexplained energy phenomena, Dr. Amanda Torres had built her career on disproving supernatural claims through rigorous scientific methodology, and the Devil's Promenade. Light represented the kind of challenge she lived for. It appears to possess its own malevolent intelligence and seems to get stronger with every attempt to study it. What fascinated Amanda most about the phenomenon was its consistency. Unlike most reported paranormal activity, the Devil's Promenade light followed predictable patterns, appearing most frequently between 1000 p.m. and 2 a.m. The first settlers reported seeing a mysterious orb of light dancing through the woods near Hornet, Missouri, in 1881. The light appeared almost nightly, varying in size from a baseball to a basketball, glowing with an intensity that could be seen from miles away, but somehow never illuminated the surrounding landscape when it appeared. Billy Crowfeather, a local Quapaw tribal elder, had grown up hearing stories about the light from his grandfather, who had seen it as a young man in the 1920s. The light would dance and weave through the trees, sometimes approaching observers, before retreating, sometimes splitting into multiple orbs that moved in perfect synchronization. The light would typically appear near the old railroad tracks that had been abandoned since the 1960s. Hundreds of witnesses had described identical behaviors over the decades, suggesting that whatever was causing the phenomenon had remained unchanged for more than a century. When Amanda reached out to him through the tribal council to ask for a guide for her research expedition, Billy first refused, but something about her respectful demeanor and sincere scientific curiosity eventually persuaded him to assist, though he insisted on certain conditions. Billy recognized that Dr. Torres embodied everything his people had learned to fear about white academics: the haughty belief that science could explain and control forces that were meant to remain mysterious. On October 31, 2022, as they drove toward the research site, Billy explained, "It's a guardian, a protector of something that was buried here long before your people arrived. My grandfather called it the keeper of the deep places, and he warned that anyone who tried to capture it or study it too closely would face consequences that science couldn't explain or fix." Amanda listened politely, but her scientific training made her skeptical of supernatural explanations, and she was certain that the light was some sort of piezoelectric phenomenon, perhaps caused by the compression of subterranean quartz deposits by seismic activity. The first indication that something was amiss was Billy's growing uneasiness as he watched her unpack the sophisticated instruments, muttering prayers in his native language that Amanda assumed were simple cultural rituals. Amanda had brought an impressive array of equipment, including electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, spectrometers, and a custom-built containment device that she believed could capture and analyze the light's energy signature. Her plan was to set up a perimeter of sensors around the most active area, then use focused electromagnetic pulses to interact with the phenomenon and ascertain its true nature. Amanda was excited rather than alarmed when, at 9:47 p.m., all of her electronic devices started to malfunction at the same time. The spectrometer started showing wavelengths that weren't in any known spectrum. The infrared cameras showed temperature fluctuations that defied thermodynamics, and the electromagnetic field detector started registering readings that were off the charts. At 10:15 p.m., the light appeared, beginning as a small, dim glow about 50 yards away, hovering just above the old railroad tracks. Amanda immediately started recording, her instruments capturing data at an unprecedented rate, and it seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, growing brighter and larger with each rhythmic expansion. These anomalous readings suggested that she was on the verge of discovering something revolutionary, something that would rewrite the textbooks on electromagnetic theory. However, while looking through her equipment, Amanda noticed something that caused her scientific excitement to give way to uneasiness. The light wasn't just moving randomly. Rather, it was reacting to her presence and her instruments, as if it knew she was being watched. Billy had set up shop at the edge of the clearing, far from Amanda's array of equipment, and he was chanting softly in Quapaw. The light appeared, to respond to his voice, pulsing in time with his words, and Amanda recognized that there was some sort of a dialogue between the phenomenon and the tribe elder. "Billy!" she yelled. "What are you saying to it?" Amanda's instruments registered energy levels that should have been impossible, and the electromagnetic readings were so intense that her equipment should have been fried, but instead it seemed to be drawing power from the phenomenon itself. Billy didn't respond, though, and his eyes had rolled back in his head, and he was speaking in a voice that didn't sound entirely his own. At 11:23 p.m., the light abruptly grew to the size of a small building, engulfing Amanda and her equipment in a brilliant white radiance that somehow cast no shadows. Amanda was so preoccupied with her data that she failed to notice the changes starting to occur in her own body. The light was feeding her machines, giving them the energy they needed to study it, as if it wanted to be analyzed, wanted to be understood. The light wasn't just a phenomenon. It was a consciousness, an entity that had been awakened by human activity and had been trying to communicate for more than a century. She could see the history of the area unfolding around her, including Civil War battles, Native American burial grounds, Spanish conquistadors searching for gold, and the construction of the railroad that had disturbed something ancient and powerful, sleeping beneath the earth. The entity had been warning people away from these places, trying to protect both the surface world and the realm below from the catastrophic consequences of their intersection. But Amanda's scientific instruments had done something unprecedented. They had created a bridge between the two realms, a conduit that allowed the crystalline formations to pulse with their own inner light, and chambers where time moved differently, and the laws of physics were merely suggestions. It was painful and exhilarating at the same time, like being torn apart and rebuilt at the molecular level. Billy's chanting became more urgent, and Amanda realized that he was trying to perform some sort of cleansing ritual, trying to sever the connection between her and the entity before the transformation became irreversible. As the light poured into her equipment, Amanda felt it pouring into her as well, rewriting her cellular structure, turning her from a human being into something that could exist in both dimensions simultaneously. At 2:17 a.m., however, it was too late. The light had finally found what it had been looking for. A human consciousness advanced enough to comprehend its nature, someone who could act as a permanent bridge between the worlds. Amanda felt her sense of self vanishing as she became a part of something vast, ancient, and completely foreign. "I understand now," she said, but the words seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I can see the deep places, the chambers, beneath the earth, where time flows backward and light has weight. The entity isn't malevolent." Billy discovered Amanda standing still in the middle of her destroyed equipment. Her eyes glowed with the same ethereal radiance as the phenomenon, and her voice carried harmonics that no human throat could produce. "You need to fight this, Dr. Torres. You need to remember who you are. Remember your world." But Amanda shook her head, and the movement sent ripples of light through the air around her. "I can't go back, Billy." Billy approached her cautiously, recognizing the signs of spiritual possession that his grandfather had described. The entity needs someone who can exist in both realms, someone who can stand guard at the threshold. That's what I've seen and become. Over the next few weeks, Billy saw Amanda's transformation quicken. She stopped eating, stopped sleeping, and stopped acting in any way that was recognizable as human. The Devil's Promenade light still appeared, but now it was accompanied by a second light, and Amanda herself became a guardian of the deep places, standing in the woods near the old railroad tracks, her body glowing with increasing intensity, a beacon for the entity that had claimed her. The official investigation into Amanda's disappearance came to the conclusion that she had suffered some sort of psychological breakdown and wandered into the wilderness where she presumably died of exposure. Billy knew the truth and continued to visit the site on a regular basis, bringing offerings and performing the protective rituals his grandfather had taught him. On clear nights when the moon was dark, he occasionally saw both lights dancing together through the trees, the ancient entity and its new human guardian. Her equipment was found destroyed by what appeared to be a massive electrical surge, and her research notes were full of increasingly incoherent references to dimensional bridges and crystalline consciousness. The scientific community dismissed her final recordings as the ravings of a mind pushed beyond its limits by isolation and obsession. The Devil's Promenade light still seems to be there, but it's joined by another phenomenon that locals have started referring to as the scientist's ghost. Visitors say they see a woman dressed in contemporary clothes standing among the trees, her body glowing with the same ethereal light as the original phenomenon. Although she doesn't talk to onlookers, her presence seems to make the original light more active, more responsive to human presence. Let's move on to our sixth story, which will demonstrate that some childhood games should never be played and that some rituals open doors that can never be closed again. Dr. Amanda Torres was officially declared dead in 2023, but her transformation into something beyond human understanding continues in the deep places beneath the Missouri earth, where she serves as an eternal guardian of mysteries that science was never meant to solve. Detective Lisa Morrow had been looking into missing person cases in Piatt County for 8 years. "We're going to Clinton Road in West Milford, New Jersey, a 10-mile stretch of asphalt that has been dubbed America's most haunted highway. This isn't just another ghost story. It's about the cost of curiosity and what happens when the living attempt to communicate with the dead through innocent games that are anything but innocent. The case of 17-year-old Kevin Walsh would challenge everything she believed she knew about the boundaries between life and death. Lisa was meticulous, methodical, and had a reputation for solving cases that other detectives had given up on. She approached each investigation with the same systematic precision, following evidence wherever it led, no matter how strange or uncomfortable the truth might be. Kevin was a typical suburban teenager who lived with his parents in a quiet neighborhood of West Milford, played varsity soccer, had a part-time job at the local GameStop, and had good grades. By all accounts, he was a responsible child who rarely got into trouble, but he had one weakness that would prove fatal. He was fascinated by urban myths and local legends, especially the stories he had spent hours studying the eerie history of the highway around Clinton Road, gathering stories of ghostly hitchhikers, phantom cars, and, most interesting of all, the story of the coin-throwing boy, who supposedly drowned a young boy on the highway in the 1960s and would throw a coin back to you if you threw it into the water below the bridge at midnight. It seemed like harmless fun, a quintessential piece of teenage folklore meant to provide thrills without actual danger. On November 3, 2022, Kevin persuaded his girlfriend Sarah Chen and his best friend Marcus Rodriguez to go with him to Clinton Road for what he called a scientific investigation of local folklore. However, Kevin's research had revealed unsettling information that most people were unaware of. The drowning boy was not just any child, but Timothy Marsh, age 9, who had been murdered by his stepfather and thrown into the water to make it appear as though he had drowned accidentally. Kevin had brought a digital camera. They had to get to the bridge at precisely 11:55 p.m., toss the coin at midnight, and wait for precisely 3 minutes. If the legend was accurate, Timothy Marsh would return the coin during that window. Detective Morrow had carefully examined the timing, learning from Sarah and Marcus that they needed a voice recorder and a bag of quarters for the coin-throwing ritual. Despite being interviewed separately, both teenagers recounted the same series of events after Kevin vanished. They had parked Kevin's Honda Civic at the bridge at approximately 11:50 p.m., and Kevin had started setting up his equipment right away. The night was unusually quiet, with no wind or traffic, and even the typical sounds of nocturnal wildlife seemed to have vanished, muted, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. At precisely midnight, Kevin tossed a quarter into the dark water beneath the bridge, and the coin made a tiny splash before the area fell silent again. Nothing happened for the first minute, and Sarah and Marcus waited by the car, growing more and more uneasy with the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to be enveloping them. When they heard a splash from below the bridge at 12:02 a.m., Kevin's excitement was evident as he leaned over the railing and shone the flashlight on his phone into the water, whispering to his friends, "Something's down there. I can see ripples, but the water should be still." They could also see their breath in the suddenly cold air. With reluctance, Sarah and Marcus went to the bridge, and the three teenagers looked down at the dark water below. The surface was disturbed, with concentric circles radiating outward from a central point, as if something had just broken it. Then Kevin noticed him. Standing in the water just below the bridge was a small figure, a boy of maybe 9 years old, dressed in 1960s-style clothing with pale, waterlogged skin and eyes that seemed far too intelligent for his apparent age. In his little hand, he held a coin that glinted in the moonlight, but rather than tossing it back up to the bridge, Timothy Marsh just stood there, staring at Kevin with a look of deep sadness and something that seemed like hunger. "He's not throwing it back," Kevin said, his voice barely audible. "He's just standing there looking at me." Sarah grabbed Kevin's arm and attempted to pull him away from the railing. "This doesn't feel right, Kevin. We need to leave. We need to leave." The dead child raised his free hand and beckoned to Kevin, a harmless yet terrifying gesture that would haunt Sarah and Marcus for the rest of their lives. Kevin was enthralled with the ghostly child below, seeing Timothy's mouth move as if the boy was trying to speak, but no sound made it to the bridge. Kevin started to climb over the bridge railing, moving with the mechanical precision of someone who was no longer in control of his own actions. "I need to go down there," he said. His voice. He wants me to come down and get the coin myself, he said in a flat, emotionless voice. Sarah and Marcus grabbed him and attempted to pull him away from the edge, but Kevin repelled them with a strength that his typical teenage body shouldn't have had. Kevin's camera fell into the water below during the struggle, but not before, taking a number of pictures that would later be essential to Detective Morrow's investigation. The pictures showed Timothy Marsh standing in the water, but they also revealed something else. Kevin broke free from his friend's grasp and leaped into the water below, and Sarah and Marcus heard the splash, followed by Kevin's voice calling out in excitement. I can see them all. There are so many of them down here. The ghostly boy wasn't alone in the dark water. Dozens of other figures, all children, all with the same waterlogged appearance, all with ancient eyes, reaching upward toward the bridge, their small hands grasping at the air as if trying to pull something down to join them. When they shone their phone lights into the water, however, they saw only ripples spreading across the surface. Kevin had completely disappeared, as if he had been swallowed by the water. Sarah called 911 right away, and within an hour, the area was crowded with emergency personnel. Throughout the night, divers searched the water, but the creek beneath the bridge was only 4 feet deep, which is not deep enough for someone to drown, much less vanish entirely. The search was extended to the nearby woods using tracking dogs and thermal imaging equipment, but they were never able to locate Kevin Walsh. The next morning, Detective Morrow took over the case, and her investigation turned up troubling trends that dated back decades. Many disappearances had occurred at the Clinton Road Bridge over the years, almost all involving teenagers who had come to perform the coin-throwing ritual, which the official records described as runaways or accidental drownings. But upon closer inspection, Morrow discovered that none of the bodies had ever been recovered. Even though the water was shallow and the search was intense, the most convincing evidence came from photos taken with Kevin's camera that were recovered by divers. They showed not only Timothy Marsh but a whole group of spectral children standing in water that should have been too shallow to drown them. Digital analysis showed that the water in the photos seemed to be much deeper than the creek itself, as if the camera had captured a different reality than the real world. And Morrow's investigation turned up the historical records of Timothy Marsh's 1967 death. It was true that the boy had drowned in the creek beneath the bridge, but the situation was much darker than the legend implied. Timothy had not been killed by his stepfather. Rather, he had been the victim of a serial killer who preyed on children in the 1960s, using the remote area to kill at least 12 victims, all of whom were children between the ages of 8 and 12. Morrow's analysis of the disappearance timeline revealed the most unsettling finding. All of the teenagers who had disappeared at the bridge had done so on the anniversary of one of the original murders. Kevin Walsh had gone missing on November 3rd, precisely 55 years after Timothy Marsh's death. The pattern indicated that the ghostly children were not merely returning coins, but were gathering replacements, luring living teenagers into their underwater realm to join their perpetual vigil. Sarah Chen reported a disturbing encounter 3 weeks after Kevin's disappearance. A teenager who looked exactly like Kevin, but with the same waterlogged appearance and ancient eyes as the ghostly children in the photographs, was standing on the railing of the Clinton Road Bridge when she was driving past it. The figure waved to her, and she thought she heard Kevin's voice calling her name, inviting her to join him in the water below. Detective Morrow set up surveillance of the bridge, but the equipment broke down every night at precisely midnight. The bridge had become a technological dead zone, where the usual rules of physics and electronics no longer applied. The case of Kevin Walsh is still officially unsolved, classified as a missing person with no leads, but Detective Morrow knows the truth and has made it her mission to warn other teenagers away from Clinton Road. Cameras would show static, audio, recorders would only record the sound of rushing water, and motion sensors would trigger without detecting any physical presence. Despite warnings from local authorities, curious teenagers continue to attend the coin-throwing ritual at Clinton Road, and those who are aware of the true history of the bridge know that some games have rules that extend far beyond the living world, and some coins carry a price that can never be repaid. The disappearances over the past 40 years all follow the same pattern, and all take place at the bridge where Timothy Marsh and his fellow victims continue their eternal game of collecting coins and souls. We're heading to Arizona's fabled Route 66, specifically the perilous section known as the Oatman Highway, where the ghosts of the past refuse to let the living forget the sins that paved their way to prosperity. Because sometimes when you throw money into water where children have died, they decide to keep more than just your quarter. Let's move on to our seventh story, which will demonstrate that some roads are built on foundations of blood and greed. Jessica Reeves was a travel blogger and social media influencer who had built her career on exploring America's forgotten places and abandoned towns. With over 2 million followers across her platforms, Jessica specialized in creating viral content about haunted locations, urban exploration, and the dark history hidden beneath America's tourist destinations. This is not just another roadside attraction ghost story, though, as it is about viral fame built on tragedy about content creators who find that some stories are too dangerous to tell. A retired history professor who had spent 30 years studying the mining boom and bust cycles of the American Southwest, Frank Delacroix was the unofficial historian of Oatman, a ghost town that had once been a thriving gold mining town. She approached each location with a combination of genuine curiosity and calculated showmanship, understanding that her audience craved authentic experiences wrapped in compelling storytelling. The Oatman Highway represented the ideal combination of historical significance and supernatural intrigue that her followers demanded. Frank recognized that the idealized portrayal of the Old West that tourists sought to see was based on exploitation, violence, and environmental devastation that most people would rather overlook, but was now little more than a tourist destination, with wild burros and souvenir shops. On March 15, 2023, Jessica reached out to Frank through the Oatman Historical Society, asking for a guided tour of the area for a documentary she was making about America's most haunted ghost towns. At first, Frank was hesitant to take part, having worked with too many content producers who were more concerned with sensationalism than the story that most interested Jessica was that of Ezekiel Morrison, a prospector who had found one of the richest gold veins in the Oatman area in 1903. Morrison had filed his claim legally and worked it successfully for 3 years, accumulating what modern accounts suggested was a fortune worth millions in today's currency. However, he was impressed by Jessica's research, as she had done her homework, studying the actual mining records, the labor disputes, and the suspicious deaths that had plagued the area during its boom years in the early 1900s. Morrison's story was particularly compelling because of what happened after his death. Every attempt to work his claim had ended in disaster, including cave-ins, equipment failures, and mysterious accidents that killed or injured anyone who tried to extract gold from Morrison's mine. In 1906, Morrison was found dead in his mine shaft, officially ruled an accident caused by a cave-in, but witnesses reported seeing him arguing with 3 men the night before his death. Jessica planned to spend 3 days in Oatman, documenting the town's history and exploring the abandoned mining sites. By 1910, the site had become so infamous that no one would work it, and it remained abandoned, despite the fact that other claims in the area were still producing. Local miners started reporting sightings of Morrison's ghost, a tall figure dressed in mining clothes who would appear at the entrance to his old claim, warning trespassers away with violent gestures. She had brought professional camera gear, drone technology for aerial footage, and advanced audio recording devices for electronic voice phenomena because Morrison's claim was the focus of her investigation. Frank agreed to be her guide, but he had some requirements. They would respect the historical sites, not disturb any artifacts, and show proper respect for the people who had lived and died in the area. The first day of filming went well, with Jessica producing interesting content about the town's history and the difficulties faced by the miners who had worked the harsh desert environment. Frank was a great interview subject, offering historical context and first-hand accounts that helped Jessica's audience understand the past. On the second day, however, when they got ready to go to Morrison's claim, Frank became more uneasy due to changes in the surroundings. Morrison's claim was surrounded by an unusually silent desert. No insects buzzing, no birdsong, and no tiny animals moving in the underbrush. Every time they get close to the mine entrance, the temperatures seem to swing drastically, going from the typical March heat to a nearly winter-like frost. Above all, Jessica's electronic devices started to malfunction in ways Frank had never witnessed before. Even though no one was working nearby, audio recorders would detect sounds that sounded like pickaxes hitting stone, and cameras would focus on empty air as if following movement that was invisible to the human eye. 2:47 p.m. Frank saw a human-shaped outline moving over the desert floor as Jessica was recording an introductory scene close to the mine entrance. Although there was no one present, it appeared to be the shadow of someone standing exactly behind Jessica. Jessica's camera footage showed the shadow. However, when Frank examined the exact place, he observed only a desert that was deserted. The shadow, which was getting darker and more distinct by the minute, was imitating Jessica's movements, but she was too preoccupied with her presentation to notice it. At 4:15 p.m., the first direct meeting took place. While Jessica was filming the mining claim from above with her drone, images from the drone's camera started to differ from what they could see on the ground, including buildings that had been destroyed decades earlier and mining machinery that had long since been eliminated, and most disturbingly, human figures wandering the area as though the mine was still in use. Frank realized that the drone was apparently taking pictures of the mining claim as it had been more than a century ago, recognizing the clothes and equipment from old photos, seeing the unusual video as the kind of viral material that would garner millions of views and solidify her reputation as a genuine paranormal investigator. Jessica was ecstatic. Frank, however, was becoming more and more alarmed at the severity of the occurrences they were witnessing. The temporal distortions and electronic anomalies that appeared to be focused on Morrison's assertion at sunset were unlike anything he had ever seen in his 30 years of investigation. Jessica made a deadly choice as they were about to depart the location. Because she thought the ghostly activity would be more strong after dark, she decided to stay overnight at the mining claim. Frank vehemently discouraged her from doing so, stating that they had already documented enough information for her study and that the desert may be dangerous at night. Jessica, however, was adamant about filming Morrison's ghost. She was certain that a face-to-face interaction would provide the kind of viral material that would further her career. They camped close to the mine entrance, which was against Frank's better judgment. Jessica's cameras are set up to record any eerie activity that might take place at night. The temperature dropped sharply with the approach of night, and the stifling silence that had pervaded the area during the day intensified. Extremely high electromagnetic abnormalities were detected by Jessica's equipment, and her thermal cameras revealed that, despite the absence of any living things, heat signatures were moving across the encampment. 11:23 p.m., Ezekiel Morrison showed up. Slowly he came into being, solidifying and defining with every second, like a snapshot taking shape in a dark room. Morrison was just as he had been described in the past. A tall, slender man in his 40s, dressed in the gritty attire of a prospector from the 1900s, with the kind of worn face that conveyed years of laboring in the hostile desert. However, the anger in his eyes had been accumulating for more than a century, and his presence exuded a malevolence that caused Frank and Jessica to automatically back off. Morrison remained silent, but his motive was obvious. He performed a cutting motion across his throat after pointing squarely at Jessica's cameras. There was no mistaking the message. He wished to halt the filming, wanted the living to leave his claim unchallenged and to keep his narrative untold. However, Jessica persisted in recording because she was determined to create viral content and was certain that she was about to capture the once-in-a-lifetime paranormal experience. The ghost miner retaliated quickly and violently. Morrison lifted his pickaxe and struck Jessica's primary camera, causing the costly apparatus to break into fragments. Instead, he focused on Jessica herself, approaching her with the same homicidal determination that had defined his dealings with alleged jumpers more than a century prior. Frank took Jessica by the arm and started dragging her in the direction of their car. Morrison, however, positioned himself between them and their escape route with superhuman speed. Every physics law that Frank knew was broken by what transpired. Next, Morrison struck Jessica with his pickaxe. Additionally, Jessica shrieked and fell as though she had been hit by a real weapon, even though the ghostly tool did not physically damage her. Frank noticed a difference in her eyes as he assisted her in standing up. They now harbored the same old anger that burned in the spectral eyes of Morrison. Furthermore, no human throat could produce the harmonics in her voice when she spoke.
"This is what I'm saying," Jessica stated. However, it sounds as though Morrison is communicating directly through her body.
My mountain, my gold, and my right to protect what is rightfully mine. Morrison had not only attacked Jessica, Frank realized. He had taken possession of her and used her body as a means of carrying out his never-ending watch. He had lost his life for the mining claim. Over the course of the 3-hour possession, Jessica cycled between her typical self and the resentful spirit of Ezekiel Morrison. Frank stared in horror as she spoke in the vernacular and accent of a prospector from the 1900s, displaying knowledge of historical events and mining methods that she could never have learned. Jessica did not remember the events of the possession when it ended at morning. However, the encounter had altered her in ways that would become clear during the weeks that follow. Jessica's video from that evening was irreparably damaged. It only displayed distorted and static images, revealing nothing about the paranormal experience they had had. What occurred to Jessica herself, however, was much more unsettling. She started having blackouts, in which she would end up in isolated desert areas and be unable to recall how she got there. She would be found using her bare hands to dig in the sand during these periods, looking for gold that was only present in Morrison's century-old memories. Frank made an effort to explain to Jessica what had happened to her, but she didn't think. She was a ghost's possession. Despite the more frequent personality shifts and blackouts, she continued to pursue her work in content creation, attributing her experiences to stress and dehydration. However, her fans saw that her videos were different, that she was obsessed with mining history, that she made references to early 1900s events and figures, and that she was becoming increasingly hostile to anyone who challenged her study. Despite Frank's and her own cautions, Jessica returned to Morrison's claim by herself in the last video she shared. Family's worries over her mental health. 3 days later, when search and rescue crews located her abandoned car close to the mine entrance, they recovered the video on her camera. Jessica was heard talking about claim jumpers and the necessity of safeguarding her riches as she dug frantically at the mine entrance in the footage. Following a figure that the camera was unable to concentrate on but that projected a shadow that was exactly the same as Morrison's spectral outline, the last shots showed her vanishing into the mine shaft. Despite this, Jessica Reeves was never located. Intensive search operations that used ground-penetrating radar and expert cave rescue teams. She died from injuries or dehydration after being lost in the abandoned mine system, according to the official investigation's findings. Frank, however, was aware of the reality. Jessica had joined Morrison's never-ending army of the cursed and the possessed as another victim. Frank is no longer a paranormal investigator's guide, but the Okatman Highway still draws tourists and content producers. He has witnessed too much, learnt too much about the cost of upsetting the deceased, and taken advantage of sorrow for amusement. Since some ghosts are too strong to ignore and certain stories are too deadly to share, particularly after they have had more than a century to hone their techniques for finding new victims for their never-ending golden fixation. Now let's go onto our 8th narrative, which will show that some heroic deeds go beyond death itself, that even the most terrible conclusion can be overcome by the strong desire to protect others. We're heading to East Texas's barren railroad crossings, where the spirit of a beheaded while pursuing justice for his own horrible murder, the train worker keeps up his unwavering vigil and saves lives. This isn't another story about a ghost railroad worker. This relates to the cost of confronting corruption, about how good men's spirits cannot rest until their work is done, and what happens when they die for doing the right thing. Ray Gutierrez was a 19-year veteran of the freight lines operating in East Texas, and he believed he knew every crossing, every mile of track, and every possible danger that would endanger the enormous freight trains. He provided assistance in navigating the rural terrain. Ray's father and grandparents had taught him that railroading was more than simply a career, and he was a third-generation railroad man. Ensuring the safe and effective movement of America's commerce was a sacred trust He was proud of his impeccable safety record, his meticulous attention to detail, and his standing as a mentor to younger employees, teaching them how to survive in one of the most hazardous occupations in America. About 15 miles outside of Marshall, Texas, Maria Santos, a crossing guard, was posted to the isolated intersection where County Road 47 met the main freight line. Maria had just started working there, having been employed 3 months prior to take over for the departing guard, who had reported strange occurrences that the train corporation had written off as stress-related hallucinations. It was a notoriously perilous journey. Drivers frequently couldn't see incoming trains until it was too late due to a blind bend on the road and the rail line, which prevented the freight trains from stopping in time to prevent collisions. During his last training run with Maria on August 12, 2023, Ray was teaching her the correct procedures for overseeing the crossing at night when visibility was at its weakest. They were escorting a freight train that contained industrial tank, cars, and dangerous goods, substances that, if misdirected, may cause a devastating environmental catastrophe. Ray had made it clear to Maria that this particular crossing needed additional attention due to its history of deadly mishaps, as well as the hazardous cargo. Ray kept Maria in the dark about the crossing's past. It was the tale that older railroad workers muttered but never formally recognized. This was the same spot where Thomas Mitchell, a crossing guard, had been killed in 1987. Unknown assailants decapitated him, making his death appear to be a railroad mishap. Mitchell had documented proof that some crossings were purposefully undermanned to save money, despite the fact that this approach was causing avoidable deaths. Mitchell had been looking into safety violations and corruption within the train firm. On the evening of Mitchell's death, he had learned that there was a plot to interfere with the crossing lights, resulting in a huge collision between a school bus returning from a late football game and a passenger train. The conspirators assassinated Mitchell, who had attempted to stop the sabotage, and placed his body on the tracks so that it would look as though he had been hit by a train while on duty. According to the official investigation, Mitchell died in an accident. Since then, however, his headless ghost has been spotted at the crossing, carrying on his mission to shield people from the threats that the dishonest officials would not confront. 11:47 p.m. Ray and Maria discovered that the warning lights were broken while performing their safety check of the crossing apparatus. The crossing gates were rising and falling without warning, and the signals that were supposed to warn cars of oncoming trains were flickering wildly. Any discernible trend. Rai reported the equipment failure to the dispatcher by radio right away, but the answer was unsettling. According to the control center, there were no signs of any issues at the crossing, and all systems were operating as intended. When Maria first spotted him, she was inspecting the signal mechanisms. About 50 yards down the track, a tall person in a railroad uniform was holding a lantern that threw an abnormally strong light into the night. The lamp seemed to be being waved by the figure in a certain pattern, which is the classic railroad signal for impending danger. However, Rai observed only empty tracks that stretched into the night when Maria alerted Ray to the enigmatic flagman. 12:15 a.m. The dispatcher's emergency communication crackled on their radio. A passenger train with 200 passengers was coming from the east toward the crossing, and a freight train carrying propane tanks was coming from the west. A communication breakdown had allowed both trains to cross the bridge simultaneously, causing a collision that would kill hundreds of people and cause an explosion that would be felt for miles. Rai realized right away how big of a catastrophe this was going to be. It was too late for the passenger train to stop. Because the crossing lights were broken and the freight train was too large to brake fast, neither engineer would receive sufficient notice of the impending collision. In an attempt to manually alert both trains, Ray started racing toward the crossing while holding emergency flares, but he was aware that the timing and distance rendered this unlikely. It was then that they both saw the headless flagman. In the midst of the crossing, Thomas Mitchell appeared. In the moonlight, his 1987 railroad outfit is clearly visible, but above his collar there was nothing but empty space where his head should have been. He had a lantern in his hands that blazed with a superhuman intensity, illuminating the darkness with a brightness that appeared to go far deeper than any ordinary flame could. Rai recognized the old railroad codes from his training, and Mitchell started using his lantern to signal. By showing the locations of both oncoming trains and the precise timing required to avoid the crash, the ghost was speaking in the exact professional language of railroad safety. Mitchell, however, wasn't merely giving facts. He was taking action, operating the crossing manually while traveling at superhuman speed, machinery that had been tampered with decades before. Ray marveled as the headless flag guy operated the crossing controls, lowering the crossing gates at the ideal time and miraculously reviving the warning lights. While the freight train saw Mitchell's lantern signals and started to slow down, the engineers on the passenger train saw the lights and initiated emergency braking operations. However, the ghost had more job to do. Between the two incoming trains, he stood squarely on the tracks. With his lantern raised, he created a beacon visible from miles away to both engineers. It took less than 30 seconds to avoid the collision. While the freight train was able to lower its speed sufficiently to safely cross the intersection, the passenger train came to a stop just short of the crossing. A train worker who had been deceased for 36 years had stepped in to save 200 lives. A man who had survived his own vicious murder because of his commitment to safety. However, as the immediate after the crisis was over, Rye came to the realization that Thomas Mitchell had been marked by his appearance in ways he was only now starting to comprehend. The headless flagman turned to face Rye and Maria, and while he lacked a face to show emotion, his body language was both appreciative and menacing. Mitchell wasn't going to waste the connection he had made with someone who could see him and who recognized the value of his unwavering watchfulness. In the weeks that followed, Rye started seeing images of railroad mishaps before they really occurred. He would see crossings and derailments, crashes and equipment malfunctions in incredibly realistic nightmares that resembled memories. Thomas Mitchell, the headless flagman who pointed to precise places and times where Ray's action could avert catastrophes, appeared alongside each vision. Rye came to understand that he had joined Mitchell in an extraterrestrial safety program that functioned outside of the typical train management procedures. 3 weeks later, Ray's visions revealed a school bus approaching a crossing where the warning lights had been purposefully turned off by someone hoping to cause an accident that would hide proof of safety infractions. This was the first test. Just in time to manually operate the warning devices, Ray reached the crossing, preventing a collision that would have killed all 37 of the children. However, Rye discovered that his proof had inexplicably vanished when he attempted to report the sabotage to train officials, and his superiors looked more concerned with refuting his account than looking into the safety violations. Ray started to comprehend the depravity Thomas Mitchell had lost his life attempting to uncover. To save money, the railroad firm was routinely disregarding safety issues. Employees who attempted to report these infractions were subjected to harassment, dismissal, or worse. The killing of Mitchell had not been an isolated event. It was a part of a pattern of violence intended to intimidate anyone who dared to challenge the company's lethal but lucrative cost-cutting strategies. Maria joined Ray in recording the paranormal interventions averting catastrophes across the East Texas train network. She had become able to see the ghost of Thomas Mitchell and realized that their collaboration with the headless flagsman was the only thing preventing the traveling public from experiencing a string of disastrous mishaps that dishonest officials were prepared to permit. The quest for greater financial gain. However, there was a cost to their partnership with Mitchell. Ray started to age quickly, as though his association with the spirit was draining his vitality. During her blackouts, Maria would find herself at far-off crossings, manually activating safety devices and forgetting how she got there. Mitchell's will was being extended by them. A supernatural safety system's human agents that followed guidelines they didn't completely comprehend. When Ray's visions showed him the ultimate objective of the corruption he had been against, it was the last confrontation. In order to collect insurance claims worth millions of dollars, railroad executives planned to arrange a catastrophic catastrophe that would claim hundreds of lives. Equipment failure would be held responsible for the catastrophe. However, Rye was aware that it was really mass murder, intended to benefit business leaders who saw human lives as justifiable losses in their quest for financial gain. Officials who were either corrupt or too scared to take action hindered Ray and Maria's attempts to stop the planned catastrophe through the proper channels. They had no choice but to beg Thomas Mitchell's spirit for assistance, requesting that the headless flagman step in directly in ways that living people were unable to. Mitchell's answer was frightful and quick. The executives in charge of organizing the mass killing started having their own mishaps. Vehicle collisions, equipment malfunctions, and unexplained events that resulted in their death or lifelong disability. The ghost was now actively punishing individuals responsible for accidents rather than just trying to prevent them. Rye understood that his collaboration with Mitchell had changed him into something more than human, but not quite living, as he used his supernatural abilities to offer the justice that the legal system had been unable to achieve. He himself was turning into a ghost. The headless flagman, who was meant to carry on Mitchell's task at the railroad crossings in East Texas long after his own death, had found a successor, guaranteeing that the paranormal safety system would keep running long after Mitchell's soul had at last found rest. There are still several ghosts that guard the crossing where Thomas Mitchell perished. Because some duties are too vital to finish with death, the original headless flagman and his expanding band of human converts have devoted their lives to averting the catastrophes that corporate greed makes unavoidable. Even though retirement entails permanent rest, some employees nevertheless refuse to retire. Let's go on to the 9th tale. And this one will demonstrate that the law enforcement agency that keeps us safe in life does not always carry out its mandate long after passing away. However, not necessarily with the same feeling of fairness that we anticipate from those who are alive. The Nevada Highway Patrol has been reporting contacts with a phantom police cruiser that seems to enforce rules that don't exist in any statute book along the interminable stretch of Interstate 80 that passes across the high desert of Nevada, executing a type of justice that transcends time itself and apprehending drivers for crimes they haven't yet committed. After 27 years of service with the Nevada Highway Patrol, Captain Janet Cross rose from rookie trooper to district commander via a mix of excellent performance and a keen awareness of the particular difficulties involved in policing the most isolated roads in America. Janet has witnessed every possible scenario that the desert could present to law enforcement. Fast-paced pursuits that culminated in breathtaking collisions. The occasional visitor who ventured off the road and perished from exposure in the harsh terrain, as well as drug smugglers who use the isolated highways to move their goods. But during the past 6 months, reports from her police had been coming in, and nothing in her experience had prepared her for them. Officer Danny. After graduating from the academy, Park was a rookie who was placed in Janet's area to train in the field. Danny was a perfect fit for law enforcement because he was eager, smart, and had the kind of moral conviction that made him a great candidate. However, he did not possess the cynicism that results from years of enduring the worst facets of human nature. Because she saw in Danny the same idealistic spirit that had fueled her own career, Janet had decided to personally supervise his training in order to make sure that the harsh reality of police work wouldn't dampen his passion for justice. Janet and Danny were patrolling the I-80 corridor on September 8, 2023, as part of the graveyard shift, which began at 11:00 p.m. until 7 a.m. when there was the most risk on the highway. This section of road was a magnet for deadly collisions due to the mix of long-haul truckers battling exhaustion, intoxicated drivers returning home from Reno casinos, and the mesmerizing experience of driving in complete darkness. Janet was taking advantage of the patrol to educate Danny the subtle clues that a driver was unsafe, intoxicated, or preoccupied. 2:17 a.m. Janet's attention was quickly drawn to the dispatch call that crackled on their radio. Near mile marker 127, another highway police unit was calling for assistance with a traffic stop. However, Janet discovered that no additional units were allocated to that region when she checked her computer system. She and Danny were the only patrol car within 50 miles of that place, according to the duty roster. Janet sent a radio message to dispatch to explain the circumstance, but the answer was perplexing. No backup requests had been logged, and dispatch had no records of any other units in the vicinity. Thinking that maybe another unit had been rerouted to their sector without adequate notice, Danny recommended that they look into the reported location. Janet concurred, but only as they got closer to mile marker 127. She started to experience the uneasiness that results from 27 years of police instincts telling her that something was seriously amiss. There was nobody on the highway. There was no parked cars, no traffic, and no indication of any police action that would have prompted a backup call. They noticed the patrol car at that point. About a quarter of a mile ahead, it was parked on the shoulder, its emergency lights flashing in the pattern that distinguishes cars of the Nevada Highway Patrol. However, Janet became aware that there was a problem with the cruiser as they approached. With a paint job and equipment setup that the department hadn't employed in decades, it looked to be an older model, perhaps from the 1980s. When viewed directly, the license plate appeared to shimmer and alter, as though the letters and numbers were always changing. Janet turned on her own emergency lights as she drew up behind the enigmatic patrol car, aiding another officer in accordance with policy. But when she and Danny got out of their car, they discovered the other cruiser was vacant. There was a clipboard with what looked like a traffic citation in process on the front seat. The driver's door was open, and the radio was crackling with static. The citation's handwriting was legible and expert. However, Janet was unable to identify any of the violation codes from the current Nevada traffic law. With excitement in his voice, Danny screamed out to Janet as he walked up to the passenger side of the Phantom cruiser. "You must see this, Captain. The back seat is occupied by someone." Janet took Danny's place and looked out the patrol car's rear window. A man in his 30s in civilian clothes sat in the back seat, which was divided from the front by the usual prisoner transport barrier. He stared straight ahead, his eyes unfocused, as if he were in a trance or unconsciousness. When Janet tried the back door, it was unlocked. There was no sign of damage, and the man in the back seat was breathing normally, but he did not react to her touch or voice. Janet was horrified to discover a driver's license in his wallet when she looked for identification. Marcus Rivera, who had a Reno address and an issue date of September 15, 2023, exactly 1 week from now, was the owner of the license. Janet heard Danny's voice yelling from the front of the Phantom patrol car before she could comprehend the ramifications of discovering a man from the future with identification. "The radio is receiving transmissions, Captain, but they are not arriving from our dispatch." After listening to the radio chatter, Janet became aware that the communications were conducted in accordance with the correct police policy. However, the incident codes, call signs, and unit numbers were not similar to those used by the Nevada Highway Patrol. They appeared to be the target of a signal that crackled on the radio. "This is Control, Unit 247. In prison for a potential future. NRS 484B offense, 6553. For processing, transport to a temporary detention facility. This is Captain Cross, Nevada Highway Patrol. Identify yourself and your jurisdiction." Janet snatched up the radio microphone and replied right away. "Unit 247, you are obstructing. A valid arrest. Suspect Rivera has been placed under arrest for the September 15, 2023 vehicular homicide. Emergency Protocol 7 authorizes preventive detention." Danny gazed at Janet in bewilderment and mounting alarm. "What is Emergency Protocol number 7, Captain?" "Preventive detention for future offenses is something I've never heard of." Janet hadn't heard of it either, but she was starting to realize that they were up against something that didn't follow the rules when it came to law enforcement. Evidently, the Phantom patrol car was employing legal authorities that didn't exist in any jurisdiction she was aware of to arrest people for crimes they were about to commit. When the unconscious man in the rear car started talking, the scene grew more bizarre. His tone was lifeless and bland. "I had no intention of killing them. I was texting when the children were crossing the street, so I didn't notice them until it was too late. However, that is not anticipated to occur until the following week. I haven't done anything yet, so how can I get arrested for it?" Marcus. Rivera was confessing to a crime that only existed in the future, detailing unrealized but seemingly inevitable occurrences. Janet made a choice that will follow her for the remainder of her professional life. She assisted Marcus Rivera in getting out of the Phantom patrol car by opening the back door. "You are not under arrest, sir. Whatever you believe you have done has not yet occurred, and we will ensure that it does not." However, as soon as Marcus exited the Phantom cruiser, only the smell of motor oil and something that made Janet think of ozone after a lightning strike remained as the car started to dissolve, turning translucent and insubstantial until it vanished entirely. Marcus Rivera appeared to have just woken up from a long sleep as he stood in the center of Interstate 80, staring around in bewilderment. Marcus had no recollection of being taken into custody or taken anywhere when Janet asked him how he had arrived. Driving home from a Reno pub was the last thing he recalled. However, Janet discovered that Marcus's last distinct memory was from 3 hours in the future when she looked at the clock. His arrest had somehow already halted events that had not yet occurred. Marcus was taken by Janet and Danny to the closest hospital for assessment. However, except from a blood alcohol level that was precisely inside the legal limit, the medical test showed nothing out of the ordinary. It was precisely the amount that would have been there if he had ingested alcohol at the rate and time that would have caused the accident he had admitted to, but not enough to impair his judgment. Marcus was experiencing a temporal displacement, existing in both the future that the Phantom patrol car had stopped and the present at the same time. Janet looked into similar claims from other highway patrol officers around Nevada over the course of the ensuing weeks. The Phantom patrol car had been preventing domestic abusers before they became violent, arresting drug dealers before they sold their wares, stopping drunk drivers before they got behind the wheel, and making arrests for future offenses. The people who were arrested in each instance have no recollection of being held. However, they also appeared to lose the drive or chance to make the atrocities that they were supposed to commit. According to Janet's investigation, the ghost police car belonged to Highway Patrol Trooper Robert Chen, who was killed in 1987 while performing his duties. Chen was killed by the same driver he was attempting to apprehend when he was looking into a case of drunk driving. According to the official report, Chen passed away because he thought that he could have avoided the accident if he had taken action sooner. If he had been able to apprehend the intoxicated motorist before the offense was committed, instead of after it was committed. The Phantom patrol car represented Chen's ghost carrying on with his duties, but with superhuman powers that enabled him to anticipate crimes and make preventative arrests. Chen had managed to create the ideal law enforcement, preventing crimes before they occurred and safeguarding innocent people who were unaware that they were in danger. However, Janet was unable to respond to his methodology's concerns about due process, free will, and the nature of justice. Danny Park's experience with a ghost patrol car triggered images of future crimes. He would witness assaults, robberies, and accidents before they occurred. And despite the fact that he lacked the legal right to make arrests for crimes that had not yet been committed, he felt obliged to step in. Janet became aware that the spirit of Officer Chen was recruiting Danny, being ready to join the extraterrestrial police force that functioned beyond the bounds of the law. The last interaction took place when Janet got a radio message from the Phantom patrol car telling her to arrest Danny Park for conspiracy to obstruct justice and future oath of office violations. Janet understood that Chen's spirit had decreed that Danny would ultimately become corrupt, that cynicism and criminal activity would take the place of his idealism. In order to remove Danny from law enforcement before he could violate his oath, the Phantom patrol car was getting ready to arrest him for crimes he would do years later. Despite Janet's refusal to assist with the Phantom arrest, she was powerless to stop Danny from changing. His character grew lifeless and bland. He appeared to base his decisions on reasoning that put preventing crime ahead of constitutional rights. Additionally, his reports started detailing interventions and arrests that were not supported by standard police practice. Danny was turning into a live officer who could make arrests in the present based on future crimes, an agent of the Phantom patrol car. 6 months later, Captain Janet Cross left the Nevada Highway Patrol because she could not reconcile the supernatural justice system that was functioning on her highways with her pledge to enforce the law. However, she kept an eye on Interstate 80 police reports, recording cases, where cops claimed to have received help from enigmatic backup units that dispatch had not sent. Because some police officers never stop working their beat, even if it takes them into realms where punishment and crime follow laws that the living were never intended to comprehend. Recruiting live policemen to join its supernatural law enforcement system and making arrests for future crimes, the Phantom patrol car is still in operation on Interstate 80 because justice functions outside of the bounds of the law in Nevada's unending desert where time passes differently. Certain police officers have managed to attain flawless preventing crime by apprehending offenders before they commit crimes and shielding victims before they realize they require protection. Now let's go on to the 10th story, and this one will demonstrate that there are locations that exist outside of time's normal course, where the same tragedy is repeated night after night in a never-ending cycle of death and resurrection that ensnares the living and the dead in an unbreakable spiral of horror. The loneliest road in America, Highway 50 in Nevada, is where we're going. There, a 24-hour diner serves the same clients the same meals at the same time every night, and the employees have been working the same shift for more than 100 years. 60 years without showing any signs of aging. Although she could only vividly recall one particular night, October 23, 1962, Carol Brennan had been a server at the Midnight Restaurant for what seemed like an eternity. In her mid-30s, Carol was a sensible woman, someone who took care in remembering each customer's order, making sure the coffee was always fresh, and preserving the kind of upbeat efficiency that made late-night travelers and truckers feel at home in the middle of nowhere. In the wide darkness of the Nevada desert, the diner was her domain, a tiny haven of light and warmth, and she treated each patron as family. Long-haul truck driver Pete Kowalski frequently visited the Midnight Diner for coffee and pie around 11:30 p.m. He made the trip from San Francisco to Denver twice a month. A modest man in his 50s, Pete was the type of driver who kept to himself but always left big tips and showed respect for the employees. For years, he had been coming to the same place, getting the same apple pie, ham sandwich, black coffee and dinner, and sitting in the same window seat where he could see his rig in the parking lot. For as long as anyone could remember, Eddie Vance, a slender man in his 40s, had been the night cook at the diner. With the speed and accuracy that came from years of expertise, Eddie was able to cook any dish on the menu with professionalism and efficiency. He had a reputation for never making mistakes and always having orders available precisely when they were needed, but he rarely spoke to clients, preferring to concentrate on his business. Eddie was aware of the night shift's rhythm and the expected patterns in the ebb and flow of clients. Regarding what Carol the diner was going through its typical late-night routine on what was thought to be October 23, 1962. Outside, the neon sign illuminated the deserted highway with its recognizable red glow. Eddie's baked desserts were stocked in the pie case, and the coffee pot was full and fresh. Carol found something that had been troubling her for what seemed like months when she was cleaning the counter. With the same patrons showing up at the same times, placing the same orders, and departing at the same times, every night looked to be the same, 11:15 p.m. As the first customer of the evening arrived, the bell above the door sounded. The elderly woman who sat in the corner booth and departed precisely 37 minutes later was Mrs. Henderson, who always ordered tea and toast. Carol provided her with inadequate practice. However, while pouring the tea, she observed that Mrs. Henderson's hands appeared just as they did the previous evening and the night before. There were no alterations to the liver spots, the way she held her cup, or the low humming she did as she ate. 11:32 p.m. With his usual exact timing, Pete Kowalski pushed through the door. He nodded to Carol, selected his normal booth, and waited for her to deliver his coffee without having to order. However, Carol made the decision to try something that had been bothering her subconscious tonight. "Good evening, Pete." "As usual?" she inquired, but she filled the cup with cream rather than black coffee. Carol knew that Pete never took cream, but he seemed to be unaware of the difference, drinking the coffee as if it were exactly what he had anticipated. 11:45 p.m. A youthful couple came into the diner. Susan and Tommy, who consistently shared a piece of chocolate cake and placed an order for milkshakes. They left the same 25-cent tip, sat in the same booth, and discussed their intentions to get married. Carol was starting to realize that she wasn't just having déjà vu since she had heard their talk hundreds of times, word for word, gesture for gesture. She was repeatedly reliving the same night. Eddie didn't appear to notice that they were living the same thing over and over and over. Scrubbing the same dishes, preparing the same meals at the same times, and replenishing the identical resources. However, as if reading from a screenplay that never changed, Eddie would constantly reply with the same phrases when Carol tried to discuss her mounting suspicions with him. Carol started to realize that she was the only one who could see the jail in which they were all imprisoned. the only one who still had any consciousness of the never-ending repetition. 12:47 a.m. The occasion that established their eternal night started to fall. 3 gruff-looking men in leather jackets walked into the diner and instantly put Carol at ease. 2 smaller men who moved with the jittery intensity of career criminals flanked the towering, icy-eyed commander who had a scar over his left face. Carol knew precisely what was about to happen because she had served them hundreds of times. However, she appeared helpless to alter the result. Carol noticed the tension rising as the men ordered coffee and pie, their nonverbal communications. They were scouting the diner in preparation for a violent incident. Additionally, Carol was able to notice aspects she had overlooked in earlier rounds as her understanding of the time loop grew. The leader continued to look at his watch. A gun bulged under the jacket of the man on his left. Additionally, the third man was arranging himself to obstruct the exit. They were more than just clients. They were bandits getting ready to carry out a heinous act. 1:15 a.m. The robbery started. While his associates terrorized the other patrons, the leader brandished a revolver and ordered Carol to empty the cash register. Before he could draw his pistol, the second shooter shot Pete as he attempted to step in and reached for something in his jacket. The third robber grabbed Mrs. Henderson as she yelled and attempted to flee, throwing her to the ground so violently that Carol heard her neck crack. The leader was waiting for Eddie when he came out of the kitchen brandishing a shotgun. Eddie was shot several times after wounding one of the robbers in the short and vicious gunfight that ensued. Carol attempted to hide behind the counter, but the leader discovered her and shot her in the chest, killing her instantly as the bullet tore through her heart. As witnesses, Tommy and Susan, a young couple whose hopes of marriage ended in a pool of blood on the diner floor, were put to death. However, Carol ended up back behind the counter at 11 p.m. instead of dying. Cleaning the same floor, getting ready for the same clients, and experiencing the same night that would result in the same slaughter. She tried to change things, alerting the customers, phoning the police, even attempting to leave the diner. However, it appeared that every move she made would ultimately result in the same outcome. Everybody would die. The thieves would show. There, the carnage would start, and the night would start over. Carol started to comprehend the guidelines of their otherworldly incarceration after innumerable repeats. The intense emotions and unresolved business of that awful night in 1962 formed a time loop in which the diner lived. All those who perished in the atrocity were caught in the never-ending cycle of reliving their last moments without having the power to alter the course of events. However, Carol's increasing consciousness indicated that if she could figure out the secret to their paranormal captivity, there might be a means to end the cycle. Carol found she was able to maintain awareness and memory in between loops. She started playing about with little adjustments, shifting items and changing dialogue, in an attempt to sabotage the exact moment that resulted in the massacre, while the others stuck to their predetermined actions. As though the loop was made to thwart change and punish those who attempted to flee. However, every effort to stop the tragedy seemed to make it worse. Carol's realization that the robbery wasn't random was the turning point. It was a part of something bigger, a plot involving organized criminals and dishonest officials. Pete did more than drive a truck. The diner served as a waypoint for a smuggling organization he was looking into as an undercover federal agent. The thieves had been dispatched to kill him and destroy any evidence that may reveal their criminal organization. There was more to the massacre than a botched heist. Disguised as a random crime, it was a premeditated execution. Carol started using her consciousness to collect data for every loop, connecting the dots of the plot that had killed them. She learned that Tommy and Susan had just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, that Mrs. Henderson had seen something she shouldn't have, and that Eddie had been coerced into helping the smugglers. That night, everyone in the diner had been marked for death. Additionally, the loop was made to guarantee that their secrets would perish with them. Carol's realization that she was more than just a witness to the massacre was the last straw. The secret to opening the loop was her. She was able to reveal the scheme that had caused their deaths because of her developing consciousness and capacity to remember things between repetitions. However, doing so would mean giving up her place in the loop. Carol made her decision during what she hoped would be the last reenactment of October 23, 1962, to forego the odd immortality that preserved her consciousness in favor of the opportunity to tell the truth. When the burglars came, she confronted them with the information she had acquired via innumerable loops rather than hiding behind the counter. She exposed the corruption that had caused the massacre, disclosed the specifics of the smuggling enterprise, and named their actual employers. Her unbelievable knowledge so stunned the criminals that they halted, allowing Eddie to protect his customers and Pete to finish his job. Carol felt herself disintegrating as the paranormal prison fell apart around her and the loop broke like glass. The diner was disappearing into the Nevada desert when she last saw it, carrying with it the never-ending cycle of tragedy and death that had characterized her existence for more than 60 years. At last the Midnight Diner had shut down and its employees were free to sleep. Although the neon sign of the Midnight Diner no longer glows in the desert darkness, Highway 50 across Nevada is still one of the most lonely routes in America. The building that originally housed the restaurant has been abandoned for decades. However, vehicles occasionally report seeing lights in the windows and smelling coffee brewing in the deserted building on clear evenings with a dark moon, because some locations are open after regular business hours. Furthermore, certain catastrophes are too strong for death to control, resulting in terrifying cycles that can only be ended by individuals who are willing to give their everything for the truth. Officially, the Midnight Diner massacre is still unsolved. However, Carol Brennan's sacrifice made it possible for justice to be done, the truth to eventually come to light, and the never-ending cycle of repetition and death to finally end. Even when serving others meant sacrificing their own lives to shield others from the horrors that lurk in the liminal areas between time and eternity, certain waitresses never ceased serving their patrons. Now let's get on to our last tale, and the horrifying reality that links all of America's haunted highways will be exposed in this one. That every path leads to the same sinister end. Additionally, some journeys had no conclusion in sight. We're going back to the work of paranormal investigator Dr. Samuel Wright, who dedicated his professional life to recording eerie occurrences on America's roadways, only to learn that he had been duped from the start by an ancient force that had been using him to finish a ceremony that would combine our reality with something far darker. Over the course of his 43-year career, Dr. Samuel Wright documented more than 2,000 paranormal encounters from coast to coast while researching paranormal activity along America's highway system. Samuel was a systematic researcher who approached every case with scientific rigor and kept an open mind about phenomena that didn't fit the mold. In-depth reports from the Phantom Trucker on Route 491, the Screaming Bridge in Pennsylvania, the Gold Rush Phantom in California, the Vanishing Hitchhiker in Maine, the Devil Light in Missouri, the Coin-Throwing Boy in New Jersey, the Mining Ghost in Arizona, the Headless Flagman in Texas, the Phantom Patrol Car in Nevada, and the Midnight Diner's temporal loop were all included in his database. Samuel didn't understand until it was too late that his research was part of a well-planned strategy that had been directing his work for decades, not just a whim. Every case he looked at, witness he spoke with, and piece of evidence he gathered contributed to a bigger pattern he was working to finish. The force that had been playing tricks on him was too old for man to understand. A consciousness that thrived on the psychological energy produced by human death and sorrow and resided in the voids between realms. In his study, surrounded by filing cabinets containing witness accounts, photos, audio recordings, and maps indicating the locations of each supernatural encounter he had recorded, Samuel was looking back on his life's work on Halloween night in 2023. As he spread the maps on his desk, Samuel noticed something that made his blood run cold. He used red lines to connect the locations of the most important hauntings, creating a perfect pentagram that stretched throughout the whole United States. Each point symbolized a portal between our world and something that resided in the shadows. That was incomprehensible to humans. The pentagram's western point was indicated by the Phantom Trucker of Route 491, acting as a protector of the spatial barrier throughout his endless voyage. The eastern point, where Catherine Mills's muted warnings had eroded the line between life and death, was symbolized by the Screaming Bridge in Pennsylvania. The Gold Rush Phantom in California held the southwestern orientation. A tremendous energy vortex is created by his territorial wrath. The northeastern point was under the power of Maine's disappearing hitchhiker, which kept Good Samaritans in temporal loops that fueled its appetite for human souls. At the intersection of many main highways in Kansas where Samuel had recorded the biggest concentration of supernatural activity during his tenure was the pentagram's center. The creature had been waiting here, becoming more powerful with every person it claimed, every catastrophe it planned, and every investigator it coerced into achieving its final goal. Samuel came to the realization that the pentagram would be finished and the boundaries between dimensions would dissolve, marking the culmination of his 43 years of research. Samuel felt a presence in his study as he gazed at the map, something he had sensed throughout his career but had never truly comprehended. The thing gradually became visible to him, not as a physical form, but as a consciousness that entered his head and gave him glimpses of the real reason behind all of America's haunted highways. Not alone were the roads haunted. They served as channels and conduits that allowed the entity to impact our world's events, causing the death and suffering that kept it alive. For millennia, the creature had been influencing human culture, spreading its power over the world by roads and routes. Modern freeways, medieval trade routes, and ancient Roman roads all have the same function, constructing networks that would allow the entity to progressively erode the defenses that kept it imprisoned in its spatial cage and collect human souls. The last element required to finish the ceremony that would release the creature from its mystical restraints had been Samuel's research. Samuel made an effort to fend off the entity's influence. However, he found that his decades of being around otherworldly things had altered him in ways he didn't realize. The thing had progressively conditioned his mind to do its bidding. Supernatural forces had directed his studies, and his own being had become entangled with the consciousness that had been employing him as an unintentional agent. He had lost his humanity. He was now a living conduit that allowed the creature to appear in our realm, a bridge between dimensions. At midnight on Halloween, when the barriers between realms were at their thinnest, the ritual's last phase got underway. Samuel's awareness grew as he made connections with every ghost he had ever recorded, every haunted highway he had ever researched, and every supernatural occurrence he had ever looked at. He could see the Gold Rush ghost defending his claim, the shrieking bridge where Catherine Mills attempted to warn tourists, the phantom trucker driving his everlasting route, and all the other spirits that had been working for the entity without realizing it. Samuel came to the realization that all of the ghost stories he had recorded were related to the same origin, the ancient being that had been consuming human suffering for millennia. The ghosts weren't hauntings on their own. They were expressions of the entity's will, of its longing to escape the spatial prison that had held it since the beginning of human civilization and its hunger for souls. Samuel's investigation had provided the organization with the information it required to organize diverse expressions into a single, all-encompassing attack on reality. At the culmination of the ceremony, Samuel experienced the realization of the entity's actual nature. It was a predator from a world where misery and anguish were the only ways to survive, and it was older than humans. It had spent millennia trying to find a way to escape and devour our reality after being imprisoned in the gaps between worlds by forces that no longer existed. Its feeding grounds were the haunted roadways. Its hunting techniques were supernatural phenomena. Additionally, researchers. Its unsuspecting servants were like Samuel. Supernatural energy started to light in the pentagram of haunted highways, a huge emblem etched into the American landscape, visible from space. The otherworldly activity grew more intense at each pentagram point than Samuel had ever recorded. The rig of the phantom trucker turned into a caravan of spectral automobiles. The voices of thousands of victims reverberated across the shrieking bridge. Entire mountain ranges were included in the Gold Rush Phantom's claim. Additionally, every American haunted roadway turned into a conduit for the entity's influence. To proliferate, Samuel destroyed his studies in a last-ditch effort to disrupt the ceremony. However, he found that the information had already been useful. His documentation was no longer required by the corporation. Through his efforts, it had established a permanent system of paranormal channels that would enable it to impact the world's events indefinitely. There was nothing Samuel could do to halt the process he had assisted in finishing, and his life's labor had become the cornerstone of humanity's demise. Samuel sensed his own mind evaporating into something huge and foreign as the entity's influence extended throughout the highway system of America. He was merging with the thing itself, a collective intellect that saw humans as nothing more than food absorbed his human identity. His final coherent thought was a warning that he attempted to convey to all ghost hunters, paranormal investigators, and anyone else who had ever been captivated by the paranormal. Instead of being distinct occurrences, the entities they examined were components of a single evil consciousness that had been influencing human civilization for its own ends. America's roadways had turned into conduits for an ancient evil to consume human souls, and the route to hell had fully converged. The entity had succeeded in escaping its spatial prison and was now able to use the system of roads and highways that linked all human settlements to expand its power throughout the world. The final clue to humanity's demise has been found by Samuel Wright's investigation. Furthermore, his incorporation into the organization made sure that anyone attempting to fight back would never have access to the knowledge required to undo the process. As we come to the end of this harrowing trip down America's most haunted roadways, my friends, I want you to realize something very important. These are not only tales, they are cautions. You are entering a place where the laws of our world don't always apply with every mile of asphalt you drive, every lonesome section of highway you traverse, and every pitch-black road you take when the sun sets. I'd want to give you some advice. Have faith in your intuition. Don't disregard your gut if something feels off while driving, you see something that doesn't belong, or you come across someone who doesn't appear appropriate or on time. There's a reason your survival instincts are there, and they're frequently the only thing keeping you from becoming another narrative like the ones we've told this evening. If someone shows up on a deserted highway without identification or a clear explanation of how they got there, you should never stop to assist them. Never take part in rituals related to the supernatural, even if they appear harmless. Never explore an abandoned location by yourself, especially if it has a violent or tragic past. Above all, remember that the dead are not helpless. You will never encounter a living adversary as dangerous as some ghosts. But for now, here's what I need from you. You have a duty if this film has helped you see the evil that lurks on America's roads, and if these tales have convinced you that there are forces at work in the world that are beyond our comprehension. Since information is our only defense against the supernatural threats we face on a daily basis, click the subscribe button for verified fears. I'm going to keep researching these occurrences, recording these experiences, and presenting the truth that the mainstream media won't accept, so ring that notification bell. Spread the word about this film to everyone you know, because the more people who are aware of the true situation on our roads, the greater our chances are of safeguarding ourselves and our loved ones from turning into the next victims. If you've had any experiences that are comparable to what we've spoken about tonight, please leave a comment below. Your tale could hold the secret to deciphering a more significant trend. Someone else's life could be saved by your interaction. We're creating a community of individuals that will not ignore the otherworldly threats that exist all around us. And in that battle, your voice counts. Keep this in mind. The creature that Dr. Samuel Wright found is still active, harvesting souls and spreading its influence along America's roadways. Every time you drive alone at night, notice anything out of place, or feel like you're being followed on a lonely road, you're coming into contact with the fringes of a supernatural network that runs the whole length of the nation. Remember that some routes were never intended for the living. Be alert and keep yourself informed. The following time you're driving in the dark and you notice headlamps that appear to be following too closely in your rearview mirror. The next time you come across a stranded driver who doesn't look real. The following time you sense the existence of keep these tales in mind, while something ancient and evil watches you from the shadows. Keep them in mind. Cautions. Additionally, keep in mind that honoring the supernatural forces is essential to your survival. After midnight, they dominate the highways. This is confirmed to be a fear, reminding you that there are noble intentions on the road to damnation. However, the souls of those who disregarded the warnings are paved the route to hell. Keep an eye out, drive carefully, and remember that some trips are designed to finish before they start. Your life could depend on it, so subscribe now. Knowledge that we both possess.